Consider this from 1517 to 1917. The Ottoman Empire ruled over the region that we today call Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria for 400 years. That is a long time, and in that time, obviously a lot changed. Before we get into what did change in the 19th century, it's worth considering just how much did not change during this period. The Ottomans were Muslim, of course, but their rule was relatively religiously tolerant, which is more than could be said for many Christian or Jewish kingdoms in Europe at the same time. Jews and Christians lived under Ottoman rule in relative peace. They had to pay higher taxes, of course, because Muslims got some important privileges. But they were allowed to practice their religions openly and even hold important jobs. In fact, the leader of the Ottoman state at the start of the 19th century, the Sultan, was half Jewish. His mother was a Jew from Thessaloniki who converted to Islam, although she didn't convert her son. There was a Jewish sultan, but there were also Jewish rebels fighting against the Ottomans, and we'll come back to that in a minute. For now, though, let's just say that the situation of Jews in the Ottoman Empire was complex. On the one hand, they had a degree of freedom that they would not have experienced in most of Europe. On the other hand, that freedom came with limits. Jews in the Ottoman Empire were second-class citizens, but they were still pretty happy overall compared to their co-religionists elsewhere. The situation in Eastern Europe was really not good. Many Jews were forced to convert to Christianity or live under very strict ghettos if they wanted to keep practicing Judaism. In Russia, many Jews were treated worse than actual serfs, and they couldn't even own property. So it's not surprising that Eastern European Jews dreamed of a better life in the Holy Land. In the early 19th century, Jews from Lithuania began heading there in small numbers. Many were attracted by rumors of an amazing land without beggars or garbage, where all the streets were paved with gold. But they quickly found that the reality was very different from the legend. Nonetheless, they stayed and made the best of it. These early pioneers helped establish the first modern Jewish school in Jaffa, the first hospital, and the first newspaper printed in Hebrew in 500 years. It was called Hamas, or Splendor. The first issue came out in 1844, and it was edited by a guy named Jacob Z. Hillel. He was born in Lithuania, studied in Paris, and then decided to move to the Holy Land, because he thought that the Jews had to return to Zion in order to rebuild their lives. That idea was actually nothing new. It goes back to the biblical prophets. But it was Hillel and his contemporaries who began organizing it as a political goal. Now, the thing about Hillel is that he was not particularly religious. He wasn't the kind of person who believed in the Jewish origins of the people living in the region or the divine right to rule over it. He was a secular thinker who saw Zionism as a way of escaping oppression and creating a better future for the Jewish people. His vision of the new Jewish state was inclusive and democratic, a place where people of all religions would be welcome to live in peace and work towards a common good. Now, unfortunately, Hillel died in 1856, so he never saw the darker side of Zionism emerge. Some of the people who started coming to the region after him were religious. They were fleeing persecution in Russia, and they brought their rabbis with them. Those rabbis declared that the land of Israel was now empty, and that the Jews had a religious duty to take it back. One of the most important rabbis in this regard was Tivei Ashkenazi, who argued that the land of Israel was not merely a historical homeland, but a place where God commanded his people to settle permanently. This notion was based on a passage in the Torah saying that the land of Israel was a gift from God that could never be taken away. The trouble was that a lot had happened in the last 3,000 years. There were already people living there. Now, as far as the rabbis were concerned, those people were not indigenous. They were descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. According to Genesis, Canaan was cursed by Noah to be a slave forever, which meant that whoever lived in the land of Israel were foreigners, strangers who had no right to be there. The indigenous peoples, the Philistines, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, and others, are mentioned in the Bible, but they are always portrayed as enemies of the Jews. The story goes that Joshua led the Jews to war against these peoples and chased them out of the land. But as far as the rabbis were concerned, that war was never finished, and the land was still theirs for the taking. The religious Zionists were a minority, though. Most of the Jews who moved to the area in the 19th century were like Hillel, secular thinkers who were looking for a better life in a new land. There were even some socialists among them, people who rejected private property and believed in working the land collectively. And indeed, the first Jewish settlement established in the 1880s was based on socialist principles. It was called Rishon LeZion, the first to Zion, and its members farmed the land together and shared the profits equally. But not everyone was happy with this experiment. One of the critics was a man named Theodor Herzl. He was born in Budapest and worked as a journalist. When he visited Jaffa in 1898, he was horrified by what he saw: poverty, disease, ignorance, squalor. In his diary, he wrote, "If we would not have known that we are civilized, we would think we had traveled back 2,000 years. The Jews come here because they can't live in Europe. They remain Jews because they can't live in the country." Herzl had a very different vision of Zionism, which for him, it was not about creating a haven for poor Russian Jews, but a modern nation-state for all Jews everywhere. He envisioned a place that would be like France or England, with a parliament and political parties, a strong army, and diplomatic missions abroad. It was a very romantic vision, but not very practical. After all, the Ottoman Empire was hardly going to allow a foreign government to set up shop in their territory. So Herzl kept his plan in reserve, writing The Jewish State in 1896, where he outlined his vision. He suggested that the Jews should buy an empty piece of land somewhere in Africa, create a Jewish state there, and then use it as leverage to get control of the Holy Land. Herzl became the leader of the Zionist movement in the next decade, partly because he was able to attract the support of wealthy European Jews, men like Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who donated large sums of money to build Jewish villages in Palestine and encourage settlement. By 1905, there were around 20,000 Jews living in Palestine, most of them still in Jaffa or in the villages surrounding it. But 2 years later, a group of Jewish pioneers established a settlement near the Sea of Galilee, which they called Tzfat. It was here that Herzl's dream began to take shape. It wasn't easy, of course. The local Arabs were suspicious of the Jewish immigrants, and sometimes violent. But the Zionists were determined to stay and make a go of it. They built more settlements, mostly in the north and center of the country. At the same time, they bought vineyards and farms in the south, near the Egyptian border. But the population of Jews in the region was still less than 10% of the Arab population, and the Ottomans were still very much in control. Then World War I broke out, and everything changed. We'll talk about that next time.